Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for our combined Sunday school class, the Agape class and the Young Men's Bible class from First Presbyterian Church here in Greensboro. I'm Lane Ridenhour, and we thank you for joining us today as we gather together online, virtually, to worship and study. Sandie Gravett, our Sunday school teacher this morning, will be joining us shortly as she continues her series on New Testament texts that were likely used as hymns by the early Christians. But first, let's sing a hymn together. Today's hymn, God of Grace and God of Glory. It was written by Harry Emerson Fosdick back in 1930. Now, you may not know the name, but he was a widely known popular minister in New York City, and he was the preacher at the Riverside Church in New York City, an interdenominational and interracial church built largely with donations by John D. Rockefeller. Mr. Fosdick actually wrote this hymn as the processional hymn for the dedication service of the brand new Riverside Church. It's a wonderful hymn, too. It's a prayer for God to bestow power upon the church and wisdom and courage for the facing of this hour. Now, the hour that was being referred to there was the Great Depression, an economic disaster that was draining the life out of the nation and a lot of hope out of the people. For the facing of this hour, however, it's a timeless phrase because there's never a time when we don't need God's help for the facing of this hour. As usual, I'll put the words up on the screen for you and invite you to sing along with me. God of grace and God of glory.
God of grace and God of glory, on thy people pour thy power. Crown thine ancient church's story, bring its bud to glorious flower. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the facing of this hour, for the facing of this hour. Lo, the hosts of evil round us scorn thy Christ, assail his ways. From the fears that long have bound us, free our hearts to faith and praise. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the living of these days, for the living of these days. Cure thy children's warring madness, bend our pride to thy control. Shame our wanton selfish gladness, rich in things and poor in soul. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage, lest we miss thy kingdom's goal, lest we miss thy kingdom's goal. Save us from weak resignation to the evils we deplore. Let the gift of thy salvation be our glory evermore. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage, serving thee whom we adore, serving thee whom we adore.
The hymn I want to talk about this morning comes from one of the more obscure letters in the New Testament to many Christians, the letter of 1 Peter. Now, I'm going to tell you from the outset that you are not going to see my face this week. That's because class has started and I am looking more than a little bit disheveled. But I still am prepared to talk about this text with you, and I want to take a little bit of a different approach. We have been focused on poetry that makes high and lofty claims about the person of Christ and ponders on theological questions such as pre-existence. We have seen texts drawing on the wisdom tradition and its philosophical musings. But frankly, it is material that makes us ponder big questions. And if you are anything like me, it can also make your head hurt. I spend a lot of time in a department with philosophers, and I can tell you from 25 years of work experience, they do think differently than most normal folks. I am far more at home with the imagination of Jesus we get today, which is drawn more out of the prophetic tradition of the Hebrew Bible and takes a hard look at suffering. It may seem a strange subject to dwell on in the season of Epiphany, but remember, Epiphany always moves towards Lent and Holy Week, and thus it is not wrong to go there. Hang with me, and I think you will see how it all fits together. While today we may find ourselves unfamiliar with 1 Peter, it is one epistle that earned widespread and unquestioned recognition in the early church. Irenaeus, who was born in 130, died around 202, was a bishop among the early Christian community and one famed for shaping the Orthodox tradition. And he provides the first documentation of 1 Peter's existence in his book Against Heresies, when he quotes from it. Other mentions or allusions occur in leading Christian writers such as Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and Clement of Alexandria, to name just a few. Although the book is attributed to Peter, the disciple of Jesus and purported rock upon which the church was built, a number of indicators mediate against his authorship. First, the sophistication of the Greek in the text far exceeds what we would expect from a Galilean fisherman writing in his non-native language. Second, the level of theological development and the characterizations of the institutional church point toward a time later in the first century, long after Peter was martyred in the early 60s. And third, the focus on the suffering of the people addressed seems best suited to conditions like those unfolding during the reign of the Emperor Domitian at the end of the first century, as opposed to the brief localized trouble in Rome when Nero was emperor. Even if Peter didn't write it himself, we can still ask this question: does it reflect a tradition tracing back to Peter? Some scholars will conclude that the church at Rome produces this epistle to honor the teaching of Peter because he was important to that community. But I have to say, there's no direct evidence of that contention. Other scholars try to put together what little information we do possess. This letter, for instance, speaks of a Silvanus, part of a production team for the text. If this Silvanus is the same one mentioned as a companion of Paul in 1 Thessalonians, then the many Pauline themes, especially from Romans, that turn up in the document of 1 Peter would not be surprising. In fact, a few scholars speculate that it was this Silvanus who took the tradition taught by Peter and made it understandable to the Gentile community that Paul was trying to reach. I have to stress speculate here because, again, we cannot know for certain. So where does that leave us? Well, it means that one of the best approaches is simply to study what we have in hand and try to make sense of it. So what do we know? 1 Peter reads much like a typical Greco-Roman letter. It opens with a salutation, it has a thanksgiving, a body, and then a closing. But it addresses a dispersed audience rather than a particular community. Hence, it gets the title of a general or Catholic, meaning universal here, epistle. This letter also makes extensive use of images from the Hebrew Bible as well as other documents in the Jewish tradition. Of the 14 direct quotes it makes, 7 come from the book of Isaiah, 3 from Psalms, 2 from Proverbs, 1 from Leviticus, and 1 from Hosea. And these are quotations from the Septuagint, or the Greek translation of the text. Scholars also identify clear references or allusions to Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, and 1 Enoch, amongst others. In fact, our text today is going to have a quote, one from Isaiah. Why such tight ties to Scripture? Probably because this writer is attempting to transform the Christian community addressed into Israel. We will see exiles in the dispersion language, along with the identification of the church as one in Babylon. In conjuring up post-exilic times, the author is taking a familiar image from the experience of the people of Israel and applying it to a new situation. They are aliens in the Roman Empire. Here, however, being in exile is not a political status. Rather, it translates in 1 Peter to remaining faithful to the church even while you are not a part of this world and this particular community. It is ultimately encouraging a community suffering for its faith to remain steadfast. Now, to understand this suffering, you have to wipe out the idea of Christians as routinely being persecuted all across the Roman Empire. That's going to come a couple of 100 years later. In the early years of the Christian movement, there were occasional conflicts within particular regions with the local population or with the Roman authorities. They were horrible if you were caught up in them, but they remained isolated to given places and circumstances. Still, when it did happen, the community's pain was an opportunity to talk about suffering and its role in the lives of the faithful and what it meant about the kingdom of God and its presence. And it also presented the opportunity to explore a larger theme as well. First, Peter is teaching Christians how to live as a minority community in a pagan culture. Let me try to draw you a picture. We can only estimate the number of Christians at any given time as the tradition develops. One method of calculation works this way. If, using the best resources available, there were about 1,000 Christians by the year 40, and then by the 4th century, Christians were 10% of the Roman Empire, that is 6 million of almost 60 million, you see about a 40% growth rate per decade. That's a fairly robust growth curve for those of you who want to do the math. Is it too successful to be believed? No. We can certainly map other movements that grew at a similar rate. These figures would mean that we see something like 7,500 Christians at the end of the 1st century when 1 Peter was being written. That scholars embrace such small numbers can often be surprising to many people. It's particularly interesting when you think about it across a wide swath of territory, because that means that there are extremely small populations in the various places where Christian communities are rooted: Jerusalem, Corinth, Thessaloniki, Philippi, Ephesus, even Rome. If there were 1 million people in Rome alone in the 1st century, 250,000 in Ephesus, and somewhere around 100,000 in Corinth and Jerusalem, and only 7,500 Christians, you can see we are talking about being an extraordinarily small minority. Those small numbers mean that each community has to learn to live in the majority population and not arouse any opposition or aggravate powerful enemies. They had to figure out how to fulfill their responsibilities to the state, which often included participating in ceremonies and festivals that were quasi-religious, and match that with their own devotional practices. In short, you had to learn how not to rock the boat any more than necessary, walking that delicate tightrope between social conformity and living the way one believes God was directing. And you had to be prepared for things to go wrong, because they often did. And that's where we come to our passage for today. Here is the broader context. They are being urged to live as aliens and to abstain from the desires of the flesh, to conduct themselves honorably so that people could see that they were good folks. They had to accept the authority of every human institution. And they believed that if they just kept the law, that perhaps they would be okay. And now I will hone in on our section. It starts out by telling slaves to accept the authority of their masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but those who are harsh. Because they said it's a credit if you endure pain, suffering unjustly. If you're beaten for doing wrong, well, you should have been beaten because you were doing wrong. But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. Now, this intro is really uncomfortable for a number of reasons. The most obvious being that it is addressing slaves and their relationship to their masters. Given that we recognize the fundamental inhumanity and injustice of any system of slavery, we should be wincing at the clear signs of a world where enslaving people was a norm, however it was done, and for whatever circumstance. It is not something we want to hold up as exemplary, much less offer advice about how to handle. Still, the idea of suffering unjustly is one that we can hold up here, and it leads us into the hymn which is printed in red. And this is the passage I want to focus on today. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When he was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that free from sins we might live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were going astray like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. Look at how this passage instructs us to the Christian life and has us singing about it. Let me take each of the elements separately. First, the word suffering here is pasco. I think we too often fail to understand what suffering itself is and how it's referenced here. And here is where a Buddhist teacher or two can help us, because the concept of suffering is foundational to Buddhism, and thus it is thought about in some depth that we don't often go to. Buddhists see suffering on a kind of continuum, and they define suffering as happening in many different realms. For instance, suffering can be caused by physical comfort or distress. It could be minor, I cut my finger on some paper, or it can be significant, my body is racked in pain from a severe injury. We also suffer emotionally. There can be frustrations and worries that are small, why won't this traffic light change? Or large, what will happen to me and my family if I remain unemployed and can't find a new job? But there are other kinds of suffering as well. Instability is one of the big ones. That is, just when we think everything's okay, life throws us a curveball. One minute you're laughing and talking to a loved one, the next there's a stroke or a heart attack or an accident. One Christmas you're together, joyful and happy and looking forward to the new year, and the next you're isolated, masked, and coming together on Zoom. There is always a degree of uncertainty as to what might be next, and that leads to a fundamental lack of ease with life itself. We live in a state of agitation. And so if, as this verse states, this is what we have been called, summoned, or invited to, it is likely an invitation to which many of us as Christians would prefer to send our regrets. The point of the passage, however, is to say that suffering is not just something we are called to contemplate. It is something we are already living, and we are called to handle it in a particular way. Now, this can be a point that is hard to grasp, but let me give you a couple of illustrations. I would remind you that we've been talking about the birth stories of Jesus recently. Just imagine that you were a young woman who found herself pregnant and unmarried in a small town. That's a lot to be worried about in life. Or the Roman shadow was over this family, according to these stories. There were constant reminders that you were in a situation where one wrong move could lead to your death. In fact, as we're going to find out in the story of Jesus, this child that was born to that young mother would die within 24 hours of his arrest and trial at the hands of a state that did not tolerate anything that even hinted at a disturbance, much less at an uprising or an insurrection. In brief, life then was always challenging, and life now is similarly challenging. Yet this text tells us, when being reviled or abused, Christ did not return that abuse in kind. Our ears ought to perk up here, because returning abuse is always the temptation, is it not? And the idea is amplified further in a parallelism. When suffering, he did not threaten. I want to think about both of those concepts. Years ago, when I was preparing for a counter-protest to a KKK rally in Wake Forest, North Carolina, where I lived, I did nonviolence training. And that's tough going. When people are screaming at you close up, right in your face, perhaps even hitting or assaulting you, when chaos is happening all around, that would be the reviling and abusing. You have to learn to control your fight or flight response. You have to resist your adrenaline, and you have to remain calm and steady and focused. De-escalate rather than fight back. When everything is breaking loose, your job is to stay steady and get your task done. And you can't do that if you're mirroring the bad behaviors being thrown at you. The idea is not to be a punching bag. And I say that because most see nonviolent choices that way. It is rather choosing different ground on which to stand. Now, sometimes that difference is difficult to see because we tend to glorify displays of overt power more than we recognize alternative ways to be powerful. I think here of Officer Eugene Goodman, aptly named, isn't he? Good man. He is a law enforcer at the Capitol riots recently. When confronted, he did not get physical or shout or scream, but he kept his head and he led the mob in a different direction, away from the vice president and other elected leaders and their staff. He understood something about how to find a different response and react to de-escalate. And that leads to a second thought that is also in this passage. When Christ suffered, he did not threaten. I think about it this way. Most of us, when we are hurting, snarl a little bit. You have probably tried to help an injured animal at some point in your life and been rewarded with growls, scratches, or bites. When we are vulnerable, as when we are suffering, we can lash out. Stay away, steer clear, leave me alone. And these are our responses. But they are not, this writer reminds us, what we have been shown or what we are to show. What are we to do instead? Well, according to this passage, we are to go where Christ went, and he turned himself over to one judging justly. He offered himself up on the tree, so being dead to sin we might live, and he healed us with his wounds. I want us to think about all three. First, we are asked asked to trust that there is justice even when we don't see it being administered in the systems where it is supposed to happen. Elie Wiesel was accepting the Nobel Prize in 1986 when he said, "There is so much injustice and suffering crying out for our attention. Victims of hunger, of racism and political persecution, writers and poets, prisoners in so many lands governed by the left and by the right. Human rights are being violated on every continent. More people are oppressed than free." Sounds pretty current, right? But Wiesel reminded us that we carry some burden to make it right. There is much to be done, much that can be done. One person of integrity can make a difference of life and death. As long as one dissident is in prison, our freedom will not be true. As long as one child is hungry, our lives will be filled with anguish and shame. What these victims need above all is to know they aren't alone, we aren't forgetting them, that when their voices are stifled, we shall lend them ours, that while their freedom depends on us, the quality of our freedom depends on theirs. We can, he was telling us, in other words, always trust that justice is out there because we have the opportunity always before us to enact it. Now, do we have to die to do so? Because that was our number 2 point. Must we offer up our bodies to make it right? Without doubt, some will have to heed that call. But for many of us, it doesn't have to go that way. Rather, we can die to one way of being and embrace something different in order to truly come alive. In his book, Man's Search for Meaning, the psychologist and writer and also Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl puts it this way. He is describing how people survived in the death camps and what he took away from that. What was really needed, he says, was a fundamental change in our attitude towards life. We had to learn ourselves, and furthermore, we had to teach the despairing people that it did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. We needed to stop thinking about the meaning of life and instead to think of ourselves as those who were being questioned by life daily and hourly. Our answer must consist not in talk and meditation, but in right action and in right conduct. Life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to the problems and to fulfill the task which it constantly sets for each individual. You could spend months with this thought, but here is where I would come down. It was horrifying for people who were living ordinary lives to find themselves cold and starving and abused behind barbed wire and smelling the death all around them. Death in specially formed chambers, followed by ovens burning the bodies of their neighbors, friends, and loved ones. Nobody could have imagined it. It demanded a reorientation of one's mentality if one was not to break. So what he was talking about was developing the ability to just recognize what every day puts in the path. Recognizing that there's always a challenge, always some suffering right in front of us. It could be our own, it could be that of another. But opening our eyes to what is in a given circumstance made it possible for us to put ourselves to the task of addressing it. And by taking on only what was right before us, we stop dealing in death and start dealing in life via every choice we make. But there's a third part as well. We do this work precisely because our own woundedness, our own suffering, shows us the way to heal others. Now, this task can ask us to go to some dark places. And if I had to sing it, I would go to the old spiritual, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows but Jesus." It is precisely when we can tune in to our deepest places of loss, and fear and abandonment and despair, that we can go where He went, and we can be both healed and we can heal others. How does that happen, you ask me? Well, the mystical Sufi poet Rumi presents us with the pathway in one of his dialogues. I said, "What about my heart?" He said, "Tell me what you hold inside it." I said, "Pain and sorrow." He said, "Stay with it. The wound is the place where light enters you." Healing, you see, is only known when we understand where and how we are wounded and open up that wound to the treatment that it requires. In turn, helping others to heal is having honed the capacity to see their pain and sorrow and suffering, to hear it, to help hold it, and thereby to assist them in experiencing the light that brings wholeness. It's a lot to think about, but I like to think of the early church singing these words, and it's not because I have a penchant for lament. Rather, when I think of all the ways in which we have a tendency, when speaking of Christ, to favor the grandiose, the majestic, the ineffable, the transcendent, this one brings us back to places where we more often find ourselves. It is in the muck of our humanity that God makes God's self most fully known. It is in the horrors of who we can be that God suffers. It is in the lowliest states of our human condition where God finds a path to love, to forgive, and to offer freedom from the bondage where we find ourselves feeling trapped. Here in 1 Peter, we are invited. We are summoned to that work. We are summoned to it in song. And we are reminded right here at the close that there are plenty of lost sheep out there before us needing those efforts, if only we open our eyes. Thank you, and we will finish up this series next week in the first chapter of the book of John.